Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper Moment number 120. The mission of our Digging Deeper Moments is to take God's Word to God's world. We are so glad that you joined us. Tonight, we finish our journey through the Bible, in which we provided for you an overview of each of the Old and New Testament books. If you're just joining us in this series, we would encourage you to look at this journey found in Digging Deeper Moments number 102 through 120. But before moving to our next subject, we want to give you a list of when each of the New Testament books was written. We did that for the Old Testament in a previous Digging Deeper moment. Now we'd like to give you the New Testament. There's one disclaimer that we need to keep in mind. The writing of some of these books of the New Testament is still debated. And so I'm going to be giving you the date I believe each book was written, but I won't have time to share why. I'm certainly not being dogmatic about this. It's just over my years of study, I've come to conclusions about when these books were written. I have reasons why, except for the last few books which were written by John, and I'll have more to say about that in just a few minutes. But for a great book on this subject, I would direct your attention to the New Testament documents, Are They Reliable? By F.F. Bruce. It's a short book, and it's a very powerful book and well written. Now first, we're going to look at the list of the New Testament books as they appear and their dates as they appear in the Bible, or in the order that they're given in the Bible. And then we're going to group them according to when they were written. So first of all, the foundation books of the New Testament, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written sometime before 70 AD, while John was written around 85 to 90 AD. At least that's what's traditionally believed. The floor of the New Testament, that is the historical book of Acts, was written sometime between 62 and 70 AD. The reason 70 AD will keep coming up is that it's a major time marker because that's when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed. And the fact that it's not mentioned in the book of Acts is strong evidence that Acts was written before this event, because Luke, who is an extremely accurate historian, would have certainly included it if it had already happened. The walls and the windows of the New Testament, that would be the letters of the apostle, and we're going to give them as the order that they're found in the New Testament. First is Romans, written around 56 AD. 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, also written around 56 AD. Galatians, written around 49 AD. Ephesians, around 60 to 61. Philippians, around 61. Colossians, around 61. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, written around 50 AD. So you can see that the dates are jumping around. That's why we're going to group them in just a moment according to when they were written. 1 Timothy was written around 64 AD, and 2 Timothy was written sometime around 64 as well. Titus around 64, Philemon around 61, Hebrews before 70 AD, James around 49 AD, though some date it in 62 or later than 49. 1 Peter and 2 Peter written between 63 and 64 AD. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John sometime around 90 to 95 AD, and Jude before 70 AD. Now, the roof of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation was written about 64 AD, because I believe in what's called the early date. There are those, in fact, the majority opinion is that the book of Revelation was written later, sometime between 90 and 94 AD, but I have some very specific reasons why I believe it was written earlier, before the fall of Jerusalem. But that's not the nature of this lesson. Now, it's much easier if we group these books according to when they were written, because when you do, you're going to see that they were written in clusters. And what makes it easier when you study it this way is we only really have 5 different groups and 5 different time periods that we have to kind of learn the history about. And when we learn the historical context, it becomes easier to understand what these books are saying, because we're kind of getting the other half of the conversation. The first group was written between 49 and 50 AD. Now, these letters were written when the church was beginning to reach a large number of Gentiles, that's non-Jews. And the 2 major hot issues facing the church at this time was how the Old Testament applied to a Gentile who was a follower of Christ, and the second coming of Jesus. So we have James written about 49 AD, though some date it later at 62. I have reasons for believing it was earlier. We have Galatians that was written in 49 AD as well, though some date it around 56 AD. I still maintain it was written in 49. Then you have 1st Thessalonians and 2nd Thessalonians written about 50 AD. And so the subjects of James and Galatians is how the Old Testament applies to Gentile believers, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians really focus on the second coming of Christ. And they were big issues at that moment. Now, the second group, written around 56 AD, these are letters written by the Apostle Paul during the end of his 3rd missionary journey, and he's writing to the Gentile churches he established on that missionary journey. And these letters focus on working out practical and doctrinal issues in the churches Paul had started, as well as sharing Paul's future plans. Remember, they're letters. We have Romans, which was written in 56 AD, as well as 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which were written sometime just after Romans. By most people's account, though there are some that say the books are flipped, but they were written sometime around 56 AD. The third group was written sometime between 60 and 61 AD, and they're called the prison epistles. These letters were written by the Apostle Paul from a Roman prison. That's why they're called prison epistles. And these letters focus on doctrinal and practical issues in the churches that Paul had either planted and started, or churches that had started or emerged from the churches that he started. Notice there's another 5 to 6 year gap. So we have Ephesians, written around 60 AD, Philippians around 61, and Colossians, written around 61. And those three are the prison epistles. And then we have Philemon, which is not considered a prison epistle. He was not in jail when he wrote this, but he wrote this sometime after he got out of prison, and it does relate to the time that he was in prison, and so that's dated around 61 AD. This leads us to the fourth group. The fourth group was written between 62 and 70 AD. Christianity became an outlawed religion. This is a big shift in the world at the time, and the church began to experience Roman persecution in addition to the Jewish persecution. Also, the apostles were either being martyred or aging, and so the Gospels were written to preserve the message of Christ, and the other letters were written to deal with issues being created by the persecution. And so we have Acts, which was written in 62 to 63 AD, which a lot of people believe was written as a defense of the Apostle Paul, who was in prison under the time of Nero. We have 1st and 2nd Peter that were written sometime between 63 and 64 AD. We have Titus about 64, 1st and 2nd Timothy around 64 AD. The book of Revelation written about 64 AD. By the way, the internal evidence, the evidence in the book of Revelation points to an early date. Hebrews was written sometime before 70 AD, Jude before 70 AD, Matthew, Mark, and Luke also written sometime before 70 AD. And group number 5, they were written sometime around 90 AD because tradition teaches us that these were written before the end of the 1st century, after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. I personally have some doubts about whether they were written this late or not, but I have not had time to drill down and study them. That's a study I hope to do in the future. So we have the Gospel of John, traditionally penned sometime around 90 AD. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, also written around 90 AD. Now this concludes our 30,000-foot journey through the Bible. But before we leave here tonight, we want to give you the big story of the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation as we kind of wrap this up. Remember, the Bible is a story. It has a giant story. It's a big picture story, and many stories contained in it. But the big picture of the story begins in the book of Genesis, where God created the heavens and the earth to provide a place for his family, humanity, to live. The first man and the first woman rebelled against God and plunged the world into chaos, disorder, and sin. As the children of Adam multiplied and drifted farther and farther away from God, things on this planet kept getting worse. Things got so bad that at one point God began again with a man named Noah and his descendants. But Noah's descendants, like Adam's, also rebelled against God, and so he began again with a man named Abraham and his descendants, who we know as the Jews. And he did this by making a covenant with Abraham, and then later he made a covenant with the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai, and this covenant is called the Mosaic covenant. But like the descendants of Adam and Noah, the Jewish nation also rebelled against God by refusing to live according to the Mosaic covenant. But God wasn't finished yet. Though everything else he had tried to do up to this point had failed due to humanity's sin, he would do one more thing to rescue his family from the clutches and consequences of sin. He would take on human flesh in Jesus Christ. He'd become human. Then he would offer his life on the cross in our place to forgive our sin. And he would rise from the dead to give us power to live a new life. Now, having saved the world from sin by his death and resurrection, Jesus began to recreate humanity and the world we live in. And so day by day, Jesus right now is making this world a new creation. But this rescue, this recreation will not be complete until the day when Jesus Christ returns and gives the universe a final makeover. That, my friends, is the story, the overarching story of the Bible. And you and I can be a part of that story as we put our faith in Jesus Christ and cooperate and partner with him as he's in the process of creating a new creation. We're going to pick it up here next week with a new study, How to Read and Understand the Prophets. You don't want to miss this one. If you really want to understand the prophets, it's going to be very insightful and very helpful. If this lesson has helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out our Sunday Morning Live podcast on either Apple or Spotify. And if you'd like to partner with us as we take God's Word to God's world, you can do so by going to our website, and clicking the How to Give tab. I hope to see you next week.